In 1984, a merchant sailor working the Strait of Hormuz could see the smoke from 3 different burning ships at the same time. Not from a distance, from the deck of his own vessel. He was already in the target zone. His cargo was crude oil. His ship was insured technically. But the man who wrote that policy, sitting in a wood-paneled room in the city of London, had just quietly tripled the premium. And the sailor had no idea. To understand what happened in the insurance markets of London, you first have to understand the peculiar geography of the Iran-Iraq War. By 1984, the ground war had ground to something close to a stalemate. 500,000 men faced each other across a contested border and moved almost nowhere. But the economies of both countries ran on oil, and oil had to leave by sea. Iran's terminals sat on Karg Island in the northern Gulf. Iraq, which had lost access to its Gulf ports early in the war, piped its oil overland and relied on tankers loading at Saudi and Kuwaiti facilities. Attack the other side's oil income, and you attack their ability to fight. Both governments understood this perfectly. Iraq struck first in a systematic way. In the spring of 1984, Iraqi aircraft, flying French-built Super Attenders armed with Exocet missiles, began targeting tankers headed for Iranian terminals. Iran responded by striking ships serving the Arab states of the Gulf that it blamed for funding Iraq. And so began what naval historians would call the Tanker War, a sustained, deliberate campaign to make the Persian Gulf commercially unusable. The numbers are worth sitting with. Between 1984 and 1988, over 340 merchant ships were attacked in the Gulf. Nearly 80 were sunk or rendered total losses. More than 400 civilian mariners died. These were not warships. They were cargo vessels, tankers, bulk carriers, container ships crewed by seafarers from the Philippines, India, Greece, the United Kingdom. The Persian Gulf, the waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil moved, had become, in the language of the insurance industry, an active war zone. Lloyd's of London is not technically an insurance company. It never has been. It is a market, a physical place, at least historically, where independent syndicates of underwriters compete to accept risk in exchange for premiums. The tradition goes back to a 17th-century coffee house where ship owners and merchants gathered to find backers willing to share the financial consequences of a vessel lost at sea. Edward Lloyd kept the coffee hot. The underwriters kept the ledgers. By the 20th century, Lloyd's had become the dominant global market for unusual, high-value, and catastrophic risk. If it was big enough, strange enough, or dangerous enough that conventional insurers wouldn't touch it, Lloyd's would price it. War risk on shipping was one of its oldest and most established specialties. The mechanics worked like this. A ship owner seeking war risk coverage would approach a broker. The broker would walk the floor of Lloyd's, call the room, and approach syndicates of names, which is what Lloyd's called the individual investors who backed each syndicate with their personal assets. A lead underwriter would quote a rate, others would follow or negotiate, a slip of paper would circulate, lines would be signed, the risk would be shared across potentially dozens of syndicates, each taking a percentage. Before 1984, war risk premiums for Gulf voyages were low. The region had occasional geopolitical tension, but tankers moved safely. Underwriters had been collecting premiums for years with minimal claims. It was, in the jargon of the trade, a profitable book of business. Then the Exocet started flying and everything changed. Here is where the story becomes financially interesting. When the first Iraqi missile strikes hit tankers in the spring of 1984, war risk underwriters at Lloyd's faced a genuine calculation problem. Nobody had reliable data on how many ships would be attacked, with what frequency, or with what severity of damage. The Exocet had already shown in the Falklands War 2 years earlier that a single missile could kill a modern warship. What would it do to a supertanker loaded with 1 million barrels of crude? The rational response to radical uncertainty in the insurance market is to raise prices dramatically until the premium income justifies the unknown exposure. And that is precisely what happened. War risk premiums for Gulf voyages, which had been running at fractions of 1% of the vessel's insured value, began climbing steeply. Within months of the first systematic attacks, they had multiplied several times over. For transit through the highest risk zones near Karg Island, rates reached levels that annualized would have cost a ship owner more to insure a single voyage than a comparable vessel would have cost to insure for an entire year in peacetime. Ship owners had a choice: pay the premium, avoid the Gulf entirely, or self-insure and hope. Many paid. The oil still had to move. The global economy in 1984 had not yet developed the strategic petroleum reserves or the supply flexibility to simply reroute around a crisis in the Gulf. Buyers in Japan, Europe, and the United States needed that oil. Sellers in the Gulf needed the revenue. The tankers kept sailing, and the premiums kept climbing. There is a term for this dynamic. It is called war risk loading. And in the period between 1984 and 1988, the tanker war generated war risk loadings that, by some contemporary industry estimates, and these are estimates, not audited figures, may have added billions of dollars to the global cost of moving Gulf oil. That cost was passed directly into the price of energy. Every time you filled a tank in 1986, a fraction of that money traveled to a syndicate in London. The question that haunted the shipping industry during these years was a deeply practical one. At what premium does a voyage stop being economical? The answer was never clean. It depended on the freight rate, what the ship owner was being paid to carry the cargo. And here's where the war introduced a second financial mechanism, working in parallel with the premium spiral. Because ships were being attacked and some ships were refusing to sail, the supply of available tonnage in the Gulf tightened. When supply tightens and demand remains constant, freight rates rise. Ship owners who were willing to take the risk could command substantially higher rates from charterers desperate to move their oil. So a ship owner in this period faced a genuinely complicated balance sheet. The war risk premium had tripled, but so had the freight rate. The net economics were sometimes, perversely, better than peacetime. This created what economists would recognize as a risk-premium equilibrium, a market that had found, however grotesquely, a functional price for danger. There were ships called Hellfire ships by the mariners who sailed them. Older vessels, already depreciated, whose owners judged them expendable. If the ship was struck and lost, the insurance payout might exceed its market value in peacetime. This is not a comfortable thing to contemplate. It means the insurance structure, under certain conditions, created a mild financial incentive to accept loss, not to seek it, but to be less than fully motivated to avoid it. Contemporary industry observers noted this dynamic at the time, and it became part of the broader post-mortem on war risk insurance in the Gulf. No fraud was established in the public record, but the incentive structure was real, and the industry acknowledged it. Between 1984 and 1988, the war risk syndicates at Lloyd's paid out substantial claims. Ships were sunk, cargoes were destroyed, crews were evacuated or, in the worst cases, killed. The claims were real, the losses were real. But the distribution of those losses was uneven in ways that took years to fully understand. Some attacks were clean in the grim insurance sense. A missile hit, the ship was clearly a total loss, the claim was straightforward. Others were murkier. A ship damaged but not sunk required damage surveys, often in port conditions that made independent assessment difficult. Lloyd's employed surveyors and average adjusters, specialists whose job was to visit damaged vessels and calculate the actual cost of repair. In a war zone, getting an independent surveyor to a damaged vessel before temporary repairs obscured the original damage was not always possible. More significant in the long run was the pattern of which ships were being insured for how much. The Lloyd's market in this period was not perfectly efficient. Different syndicates had different appetites for Gulf risk. Some were writing coverage aggressively at high premiums, others were pulling back. The result was an uneven exposure across the market. Some syndicates were accumulating serious war risk liability, while others were collecting premiums for policies on ships that, statistically, were unlikely to be attacked. The overall financial outcome for Lloyd's as a market, not for every individual syndicate, but for the market in aggregate, was, according to the historical record, net positive in the tanker war years. The premiums collected exceeded the claims paid. The war was, for Lloyd's, collectively profitable. This is not an accusation. It is what insurance is supposed to do. The market had priced the risk high enough to cover its losses and still return income. The question history asks is, high enough or too high? Tanker war did not break Lloyd's of London, but it contributed to conditions that led to one of the most dramatic institutional crises in the history of insurance, a crisis that unfolded in the late 1980s and early 1990s and cost the market's individual backers, the names, somewhere between $8 and $12 billion in total losses. That figure is documented. It was the subject of parliamentary inquiry, litigation, and eventual regulatory reform. The Lloyd's names were not faceless corporations. They were doctors, lawyers, retired military officers, minor aristocracy, successful professionals, people who had been recruited to back Lloyd's syndicates with the promise of steady, passive income. Their liability was unlimited. If a syndicate's losses exceeded its premium income, the names behind it were personally responsible for the difference, down to their houses if necessary. The phrase Lloyd's used proudly for generations was, "Names are liable to the last shirt on their backs." In the late 1980s and early 1990s, that stopped being a quaint expression of financial rectitude and became a literal description of what was happening to thousands of people. The Gulf war risk exposure was one piece of a much larger catastrophe: asbestos liability from the United States, Hurricane Hugo, the Piper Alpha oil platform disaster, but it was a piece. Some syndicates that had been heavily exposed to Gulf War risk had underestimated their long-tail liability, meaning claims that would arrive years after the policies were written. The names who had backed those syndicates received calls. The calls asked for money, not premium income the other direction. The name owed the syndicate. Some individuals received demands for hundreds of thousands of pounds. Some lost everything. The Sunday newspapers in Britain ran their stories. There were support groups. There was litigation, some of it successful, against managing agents accused of negligence or worse. The Lloyd's crisis became one of the defining financial scandals of the early 1990s in Britain, and the tanker war was threaded through it. So let's follow the money to its resting places. A portion of the war risk premiums, a significant portion by any historical accounting, was paid out in legitimate claims. Ships that burned, crews that were evacuated, cargoes that sank. That money went to ship owners, to cargo insurers, to the families of sailors, distributed through the legal architecture of maritime claims settlement. It went where it was supposed to go. Another portion was retained as underwriting profit by the syndicates that priced correctly and avoided catastrophic concentration of risk. Those funds were distributed to the names behind those syndicates as returns on their unlimited liability investment. Some names did well in these years. The Gulf was, for the careful syndicates, a lucrative book. That money went to the professionals, the retired officers, the lawyers with weekend houses in Devon, quietly without public notice as investment returns. A third portion disappeared into the structural chaos of the Lloyd's market itself, reinsurance spirals where syndicates had reinsured their own risk with other syndicates which had reinsured back, until a single large loss could ricochet around the market, amplifying itself, each layer taking a cut. The tanker war fed these spirals. Money moved in circles, and each revolution extracted a percentage. And a fourth portion, this is the one with the broadest reach, never arrived at Lloyd's at all. It was paid by consumers at the pump, by manufacturers paying more for feedstock, by airlines paying more for jet fuel. The war risk premium was embedded in the freight rate, which was embedded in the cargo cost, which was embedded in the price of oil derivatives globally. It was broadly distributed invisibly across the economies of every country that imported energy. No individual transaction was large enough to notice, but in aggregate, the repricing of Gulf risk in 1984 and the years following added a structural premium to the world's energy supply that lasted for the duration of the conflict. The tanker war ended in 1988 with the ceasefire that concluded the Iran-Iraq war. The ships stopped burning, the premium loadings fell, the Gulf reopened as a normal commercial waterway, and Lloyd's, having survived the war, walked directly into its own catastrophe, one it had been building for a generation. The sailors who crossed the Strait of Hormuz in those years, the ones who could see 3 burning ships from one deck, mostly kept sailing. Some of them made more money in those 4 years than in the decades before or since. Danger pays, it always has. The question is who prices it and for whom. If you had been a Lloyd's underwriter in 1984, sitting in that wood-paneled room, watching the attack reports come in, knowing you held the pen that set the price, how high would you have gone?